Hello and welcome to My Book, a podcast about books and their authors, produced by Cine Ink in London. I'm Andrew Whitehead. In this episode, I'm going to be in conversation with Nicholas Nugent, who's written a book, a sumptuous book, Spice Ports, Mapping the Origins of Global Sea Trade, which has just been published by the British Library.
I wanted to tell the fascinating story of how spices, Oriental spices in particular, drove international trade. That's my belief, and I've tried to prove that over the course of the book. It started really with spices and Europe's demand for them, and today we have big container ships that bring all sorts of goods all around the world, but especially from the East to Europe and America. There is a darker side to this history in that each of the European nations who were engaged in the trade then attempted to maximise their profits, first by enslaving local people, and later by transporting labourers between continents to work as slaves.
Nicholas Nugent. Nick has 40 years or more experience as a journalist, editor and writer, notably for the BBC World Service. He's the author of a biography of India's former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, which was published by BBC Books. And he's also written books about Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam and Myanmar. And of course, the new book about spice ports, which we're going to be talking about now. But I also need to say that Nick, who joins me here, is an old friend and colleague. We've worked together for many decades, but this is the very first occasion that I think I've ever interviewed you.
I think so. We were both more used to being interviewed by other people, perhaps. So this is quite an honour to be interviewed by a former colleague.
And an honour for me, especially having had the privilege of reading the book as it was in gestation. But what prompted you to write this book? It's a very substantial book. It's wonderfully illustrated. It's the result, obviously, of a huge amount of not just research, but care, interest in the spice trade and spice ports. But where did that start?
Well, I'm interested you used the word of having read it in gestation. You read it towards the end of its gestation because it's had a very long gestation. I could say conception was several decades ago when I was a volunteer working in Indonesia for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, and I was assigned Eastern Indonesia as liaison officer. So that's where the idea grew from. And on my first visit to the Spice Islands, I became aware of a remarkable story of the contest between colonial powers for control of the source of certain key spices.
Which spices? Which ones are we talking about?
We're talking about clove, nutmeg and mace.
Now, clove and nutmeg I can visualise. Mace I can't so well.
Well, mace is actually part of the nutmeg plant. It's the red covering, the bright red, crimson covering of the nutmeg when you first cut open the fruit. It has a sort of pulpy outside. You cut that open, you've got the bright red mace and the nutmeg inside, which most people know what a nutmeg looks like, and perhaps less so than mace. But there was a time when mace was commanding higher prices in Europe than the nutmeg. So the significance of these are that nutmeg and mace from the same tree came from a bunch of islands, no more than about 8 islands in the southern Spice Islands of Indonesia. And the clove came from a similar number of islands in the north, actually right on the equator. And the remarkable thing was that they grew nowhere else in the world. So once Europeans and indeed others, because the Arabs first traded in them, and the Chinese. So once people became aware of the culinary and other properties of these spices, there was a demand for them. And this is, my thesis is that this generated long-distance trade, which we take for granted these days.
And this is a really interesting argument because you're saying that the trade in spices was the impetus for global sea trade, which is still the way that most goods are traded today.
Indeed. And I don't think that's too unreasonable a premise when you look at the facts. And especially you look at the high profits that the traders made on them. You can immediately see the demand was high. And by the nature of things, 8 islands for each of those key spices, supply is limited. extraordinarily limited.
And you've structured the book as an account of 12 spice ports, both exporting ports and importing ports. And I'm not going to give away all 12 because part of the fun is, which ones are the ones that you've written about. But when I looked down the list and I read your chapters, the one that I think most surprised me, I didn't see Alexandria as a spice port.
Ah, well, but in the days when there were no direct connections between Europe and Asia, you had indirect connections. So in other words, there was a trade across the Indian Ocean to the African continent, or what we think of now as the Middle East, and there was a trade across the Mediterranean to places like Alexandria, Tyre and Sidon and such forth, and there was transshipment of goods across the not quite the Arabian Peninsula, but where the Suez Canal now exists. And indeed, a very early form of transshipment was transshipping from, well, Aden was a significant port in those early days, but also the Egyptian coast from the Indian Ocean coast to the River Nile. And the River Nile exited into the Mediterranean close to Alexandria. In fact, in those days, probably through Alexandria, though nowadays it's quite some kilometres to the east of Alexandria. So Alexandria became a key trading port with Venice, especially with Venice. That's the way spices first reached Europe. And as you've indicated, Venice was ahead of the game in terms of shipping across the Mediterranean. So it's an island, or it was an island, and they needed to import almost everything. So they built the ships.
But when we're thinking about the origins of trade between Europe and Asia, we tend to think of the Silk Road.
That was an important route as well. But probably, the Silk Road is actually the Silk Roads. It's a lot of different land routes. And as I'm indicating, even the spice trade involved land routes. So in a way, you're talking about the balance between land transportation and sea transportation. And in the case of spices, it was largely, but not exclusively, sea transportation. But look back at it, it wasn't competition. We weren't saying, how do you get the spices to Europe the fastest? All these routes are relevant. And nowadays, we talk about the maritime Silk Road, which is some sort of comparison between the two. But I think we should think of them as entirely separate business, which is why in the title of the book we stressed the word maritime. We're essentially looking here at the maritime trade in spices because mostly they came that way.
We are, I suppose, or we might be seen as two old India hands, and we're both wearing what might be termed Nehru jackets. India is the only country which has two ports featured in your book, and they're both on the same coast as well.
Yes. Well, arguably, I would say it was three, because one chapter covers both the Malabar coast and Goa, which are distinct, as we all know. And how do I justify that? But it begins to become a bit of a colonial story, I admit. But Vasco da Gama, who came from Portugal and was and Lisbon is the port from which he took off. So he following the monsoons, sailing ships brought him to the Malabar coast. As it happens, Kerala, as we know, is a key source of spices.
And Cochin still has a spice market.
Absolutely. It's if you want to get embroiled in spices, you go to Kerala. So Vasco da Gama ended up there by chance. But one has to assume that part of the motivation for the trip in the first place was to beat the Venetians in bringing spices to Europe. So he was wise, he or his companions, or indeed those who financed the trip, which was the Portuguese royal family, they were wise to the fact that there were some commercial benefit in bringing spices from India. Well, they were wise to the fact that where Vasco da Gama landed was the source of some key spices. Goa follows from that because the Portuguese, having settled minor settlements in Travancore or the Malabar coast, then took a chance and captured Goa, which which was a key Middle Eastern Arab trading centre. So in a way, the Portuguese were taking over from the Arabs in using Goa as a key port. So that's, part one and part two. Bombay has a lot to do with the Brits arriving and trying to upstage the Portuguese and others who were interested. In fact, Bombay was controlled colonially by the Portuguese before the Brits arrived, and they did a deal because the Portuguese weren't making any money out of it, and the Brits thought they had a better chance. It's quite an elaborate story, and it's spelt out in the chapter on Bombay in the book. But it both was introducing the Brits, or the English, I should say, because it was the English East India Company that settled Bombay, and indeed made it something of the city it is today. That explains why there are three ports. I mean, I could have talked about Kolkata and Madras, but they seem to be less significant in terms of spices. So Kolkata, of course, was very significant in terms of tea, cotton. Cotton, Bombay as well. Tea and opium are the two, I should say, were key.
I take it opium is not a spice.
Opium is not a spice. But I have in the book gone beyond the obvious spices. I mean, we've mentioned the three that originally came from what is now Indonesia, but the Indian ones would be peppercorn, cinnamon, and ginger. Those would be three more indigenous to India until Sumatra became the biggest peppercorn producer. But they're indigenous to India. They started there. But I've also featured in the book a bit about coffee, a bit about tea, a bit about cotton, and a bit about rubber. Okay. Because these are all examples of plants of, as the famous book by Henry Hobhouse would call them, plants of wealth that moved from their original source. As everyone knows, tea came from China until it was developed in the northern reaches of India, especially Assam and Darjeeling, and indeed Sri Lanka or Ceylon. So all these stories come in, and I'm rather keen on the rubber one, actually, because when you think that rubber was entirely indigenous to the Amazon, how come Southeast Asia is overwhelmingly the dominant rubber producer of this age? And the answer to that comes in two places: Kew Gardens, near London, and Singapore Botanic Gardens, because transplantation of the rubber came through those two centres.
You're listening to My Book, a podcast about books and their authors with me, Andrew Whitehead. This podcast has been produced by London-based digital media house Cine Ink. Welcome back to my conversation with Nicholas Nugent, the author of Spice Ports, Mapping the Origins of Global Sea Trade, published by the British Library. We've been talking about the trade and its roots. There's a romantic air to spice and the trades. It's an elite product. It's expensive. But as you make clear in your book, there was a downside to the spice trade. There were some really quite unpleasant aspects of it. And I wonder if I could just invite you to read a short extract which reflects that.
There is a darker side to this history in that each of the European nations who were engaged in the trade then attempted to maximise their profits, first by enslaving local people, and later by transporting labourers between continents to work as slaves. And this has resulted in a legacy that the descendants of those who suffered find hard to forgive, and the descendants of the perpetrators find shameful to remember.
Bearing all that in mind, Nick, do you think the spice trade was a force for good in human history or not?
Gosh, that's a big question, because as with any significant development, as I believe the spice trade was, there are a lot of aspects to it. There are winners and losers, let's put it like that. But what is unmistakable is that the spice trade was closely linked to colonization, colonialism, and sadly also to slavery. Slavery came in different shapes and forms, and nowadays we tend to think mostly of the transatlantic trade in slaves from West Africa to the Caribbean or southern United States. But just think the Venetians who started this thing off, they used slaves to row their galleys on the Mediterranean. But my understanding from a reading of the subject is that they were not usually chained, and you could say they were cheap labour. And you could also argue, I'm not arguing, I'm not an authority on that, but you could also argue that the rowers, the oarsmen of the Venetian galleys, were glad to be fed, because otherwise they might not have employment. Now, I'm not trying to justify slavery in any sense. I'm only trying to point out that slavery comes in different shapes and forms. And some of it, especially I might say in what is now Indonesia, was quite iniquitous and quite unforgivable with our 21st century mindset.
Wouldn't you say that all slavery is unforgivable?
I think I would. But I'm really saying slavery came in different shapes and forms, and some was worse than the rest. I'm not justifying it at all. But when does colonization become slavery, and is there not an element of slavery in almost all colonization? That's what I'm having difficulty with. But the important thing for me was not to cover up. Where you became aware that some relatively inhumane tactics had been used, then write about it, expose it, talk about it. It happened. What we do about it in the 21st century is another issue, and I like the fact that museums and publishers are much more open than they once were. There's no attempt to justify what happened in the past, only to record that it happened in the past. Okay. And my own family probably had a minor role in slavery.
This is in the Caribbean?
In the Caribbean, yes. Which one can't conceal.
Which Caribbean island was this?
Well, this is a slightly different story, but my family were 2.5 centuries in the island of Antigua.
2.5 centuries?
Yes, from 1720 till the 1950s.
So they were early colonizers?
They were part of the colonial system.
And sugar estates?
Yeah, absolutely sugar estates, but they didn't own the sugar estates, they managed them, which makes me feel a bit better. and indeed, well, before you push on this, my 3 times great-grandfather was instrumental in the ending of slavery in Antigua. So, as my good Antiguan friend says, we were the good guys. Now, I can't be quite sure of that, but you asked me a very specific question, and I'm telling you it's something I had to go through in my own mind. Were we the bad guys or the good guys? And on balance, we seem to have been on the good side, though I can't acquit my ancestors of some sort of involvement in the colonial business. Overall.
But that's understood. And I know you've visited Antigua quite often. I wonder, have you been to all the spice ports that you write about in this book?
Yes. Let's just stress that Antigua doesn't come into the book, because I'm only talking about the Oriental spice trade. But I have been to all the major ports. There's only one minor port in which I haven't set foot. Are you going to guess what that is?
Port Louis?
No, I've been to Port Louis. I've been there twice, actually. That Port Louis being in Mauritius, and that comes into the chapter that essentially focuses on Cape Town.
Ascension?
No. Well, I haven't been to Ascension, but I don't regard Ascension as a significant port. No, it's between the two. It's St. Helena in the South Atlantic, famous for Napoleon's incarceration there. And that's the only one I haven't set foot, and I hope one day I will.
You talk about your Caribbean heritage, and I wonder if that predisposed you to having a career which has seen you travel across the world, particularly for the BBC. Do you think there is some link between that your family history and that sort of dispensation that you've enjoyed to report from so many different countries?
Well, without a doubt. I mean, my own father was brought up in Antigua, so he was a product of the colonial service.
So when did you go there for the first
his
time?
His father was worked most of his life in Nigeria, and my maternal grandfather had a stint in Assam in India. So
what was he doing there?
Difficult for me to tell. I've got the photos. He didn't seem to stay there very long, but he came from a boat building background or ship building background, and not a lot of ships in Assam. So I don't entirely know, but he had these sort of dim memories of India, and that undoubtedly, I don't know, made me become a bit of a wanderer, working, even before I was in Indonesia, working in India for a while.
So would it be fair to say that you're more directly a product of empire than most people?
Yes, it would.
And how do you feel about empire?
Well, I'm a latter-day, I won't call myself a latter-day imperialist because I'm not very comfortable with the notion of empire, and I'm glad it's over. But of course, not over entirely. We have the rich world and the less rich world. So colonialism has lingered and helped shape our modern world. Nothing we can do about it. But I did feel my first visit to India was quite an eye-opener to relationship between nations, apart from anything else. I'm making it sound rather grand. I mean, it's a bit corny to say I left school and began my education, but there's quite a lot of truth in that, because I started to see my own country through the eyes of others, Indians in particular, in that stage. So yes, it was an awakening for me, and possibly when I say the story, I conceived the idea in Indonesia, I possibly should go back 3 years and say I conceived the notion of the relationship between nations and early trade when I lived for a while in India, way back in the late 1960s.
And you were, I know, because we've talked about this, you were teaching at Doon School, which is one of the most elite schools in India. And I also know, because I've seen the photograph, that you met a group of very famous British visitors.
Oh, cue to talk about my friends, the Beatles. It is
just the most extraordinary photograph.
Yes. Well, it was my, you could say, good fortune at a time when the Beatles were every teenager's idols, to be in India when they chose to come and follow transcendental meditation at Rishikesh, which was just down the road, an hour's drive from Dehradun. So I played hooky, almost. I was very friendly with the musician, Pratap Music House in Dehradun, the owner of that, Ajit Singh, the late Ajit Singh, who invited me and a colleague along when he was delivering musical instruments to the Beatles. So you can't get much more fortunate than that. And I will add one thing, that in a way that's how I became a journalist, because I reported on this to the New Musical Express, a paper for which I've never written since.
I used to get the NME every week.
Wow.
I will probably have read your piece
Well,
without
you're
knowing
a bit younger than me, so...
But I was still in 68, I would have probably been reading the NME.
Okay, well, have you seen the article? No, that was my break. That was my break, and decided that I perhaps was better suited for journalism than for teaching.
And we're talking about empire. We both worked for, when I say years, that's not true, decades for the BBC World Service. And I think it's true that we're both very proud to have worked for the BBC World Service.
Absolutely.
And it helped us to see the world, helped us to understand the world, and we really appreciated being part of trying to inform the world. But of course the BBC World Service was set up as the BBC Empire Service, and I've often wondered, did I work for an organisation which had an imperialist agenda? Was I trying to indoctrinate? Was I trying to whitewash? Not personally by design, but what the organisation at some stage had been set up to do?
Well, I think you're not alone in that. I mean, all we Brits who worked for the BBC World Service possibly had those same thoughts, concerns, challenges, let's call it. But I, as I'm sure you did, I came to cherish the values of the BBC, which go beyond the World Service, the values of the BBC: report things as they are, don't take sides, inform. You're not in a persuasion battle, you're not trying to win votes, you're trying to distribute the truth. It may sound rather grand, but those are the ideals that we worked to at the World Service, and I like to think I still work to, even in writing the book. Maybe a very different sort of agenda. So I would credit the BBC training not just for the BBC experience, should we say, not just for what we did at the time, which in my case, and to some extent your case, was largely reporting from Asia or broadcasting to Asia, because most of my career was tied up with Asia. I cherish those values, and I cherish what it did for me in perhaps opening our eyes that little bit wider. And I didn't have this burden of empire sitting on my shoulder, because I thought it was past. Even most of the countries that we're talking about that were formerly part of empire, they were mainly independent by the time we were working there. I can remember visiting East Timor, for example, just as it was gaining its independence from Indonesia after having once been ruled by Portugal. So, yes, we observed the closing stages. Speaking for myself, I observed the closing stages of empire, but I didn't feel burdened by that, but very conscious of it all the time. And I sometimes relish the fact that relationships between the countries that were colonized and the colonizers, broadly speaking, have been very positive in the era that we've worked through, we've reported through. There are exceptions, of course, but broadly speaking, the post-colonial experience has been quite a positive era, I would argue. Am I trying to justify? No, because I'm not really expressing an opinion on what went on before, except to feel a little uncomfortable about what went on before.
We're coming towards the end of the podcast, but one of the most marvellous things about your book is the illustrations, the maps, the prints in colour, produced at a good size so that they're clearly legible and you can enjoy them on high quality paper, all those things which authors really have to battle for sometimes. But if you did battle for it, you've won that battle. Mm-hmm. Where did you get these images?
Well, I didn't tell you that I'm a great enthusiast for antique maps and views. And part of I don't know if it was an excuse for writing the book or spurred the writing of it, but as I was writing it, I was collecting old maps to tell the story, because I felt the story deserved to be illustrated, and maps and old views are the obvious way to do it. So the majority of the illustrations in the book come from my own personal collection.
You must have a magnificent collection.
I do.
How many items?
I have something like 120 antique maps. Well, that's it really, because I constrained myself by sticking, broadly speaking, to those 12 ports that have given rise to the chapter. And if it was a lovely image of somewhere outside this route, then I didn't buy it, I didn't collect it, but I collected quite a lot. And most of them hang on the wall in my house.
Well, I've seen one or two, but I didn't have any idea that you had so many. And these are precious. They are precious.
I submitted 120. British Library wanted some of their maps to complement mine, which is reasonable, isn't it? I say maps,
but how marvellous that their maps are complementing yours rather than the other way round.
And what they particularly liked was I found one or two maps or images of theirs which had never been published before. So I brought their maps, and particularly one of early Bombay, of the islands before Bombay was linked. I found in the British Library map room, and I told them I thought this was a treasure, and ultimately it's been given its spread in the book. I'm very, very pleased about that.
So if those who are listening to the podcast want to see that, they'll have to get a copy of the Spice Ports. But what's your next book going to be about?
Well, I've spent roughly 50 years thinking about this, but 25 years working hard on this. I don't think I have another book of that scale in me. But I do have one or two ideas which are under discussion with the publisher. But I don't think I'll write a big book like this. As you indicated, I've written earlier books, but this is far and away the biggest challenge, both in terms of depth of content, in range through those 12 different ports, and also the volume of illustrations. There are nearly 200 illustrations in this book.
I absolutely understand that this is a hugely substantial piece of work as well as a publication. But, we're just talking privately. There's nobody else in the room. Let me tease out these ideas that are playing around in the back of your mind for your next work, even if it's not quite this substantial.
Well, I will tell you one, which doesn't have a direct South Asian link, but I'll tell it to you anyway. My chapter 11 is on New York and Salem, and partly New York because New York, there's a significant episode in history between the Dutch and the British ended up controlling New York. I'm talking about roughly 1667, and the Dutch got what they wanted, which was control of the monopoly of nutmeg and mace. Sadly for the Dutch, the monopoly was breached because several nations, including the British and the French, had transplanted nutmeg by that time. So it didn't work quite so well for the Dutch. But the thought that a tiny little island that produced only nutmeg was breaching the monopoly, and the Dutch got that, and the Brits got Manhattan and the hinterland, it's really the key story that drove me to this. But anyway, I've gone a bit off the track of your question. Salem, to the north of New York, in Massachusetts, just north of Boston, it's not a port these days because it just doesn't have the depth, and Boston overtook it. But in those days, it was the main port of import of peppercorn from Sumatra. So from under the eyes of the Dutch, who were purporting to rule what I'm calling Indonesia today. In those days, we called it the Malay Archipelago. Then it became the Dutch East Indies. So that trade with Salem in peppercorn was a key. America's first millionaires were pepper millionaires. Can you believe it? I mean, that's remarkable to me. But why, you asked about the next book. A lot of my source material for Salem, I went to Salem 2 years ago, and you cannot find the author. I'm just forgetting his name offhand, but I can mention it later. Author who wrote a lot about Salem in the 1930s and 1940s, and it's all out of print. I got hold of 2 of his books. 2 others I read in the British Library. So there has been a suggestion that either those books should come back into print, or perhaps I could summarise them, because I think the story is so worth telling, which I have told. But if people want to go into it in more depth and realise how Salem, a city we now think of as about witches.
Yeah, that's right. When you mention Salem, the only thing I can think of are the witch trials.
You go into the shops and it's all about witches.
Yeah.
And a little bit about Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous writer from Salem. But Salem got big on peppercorn, and I want the people of Salem to know that. Unfortunately, I've been invited to give a talk at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem in January, and I will be belabouring the point that their city grew on peppercorn and the trade in pepper from what is now Indonesia.
Well, Nick, we look forward to that book in due course, but thank you very much for coming along to talk about your latest book, which I again will warmly recommend.
Thank you.
That book is entitled Spice Ports, Mapping the Origins of Global Sea Trade by Nicholas Nugent, and it's published by the British Library. The book's available on Amazon and other outlets. My Book podcast show has been produced by Pervez Alem and Achal Sharma for Cine Ink, a hub of podcasts based in London. To listen to other episodes of My Book show, you can visit the Cine Ink website, www.cineink.com. Cine Ink podcasts are also available on Apple, Spotify and YouTube. Thank you again to Nick Nugent, and this is Andrew Whitehead signing off. Goodbye.